Hello again, everybody. Welcome to part 4 of our Chapter 13 lecture series. This section is entitled The Rise of the Republican Party. The focus question for this section is what combination of issues and events fueled the creation of the Republican Party in the 1850s? By the 1850s, the northern economy had pretty much completed the market revolution. The majority of the northern workforce no longer labored in agriculture. And there was also mass immigration from Europe at the time, which funneled tons of cheap labor into the industrializing northern economy. There was explosive economic growth, which was galvanized by the completion of the railroad network. As you can see by this map right here, the northern states had a pretty substantial railroad network which opened vast new territories to commercialization. And compare that here to the network as it existed in the South at the time, which was much less developed and much less connected than its northern counterpart. Partly as a result of this completion of the market revolution and the expansion of the railroad network, the Industrial Revolution spread extremely rapidly in the North. And as a result, there was a much more diverse and dynamic economy in the North than in the South, which still clung to plantation agriculture. Before we get to the Republican Party itself, we need to discuss the rise and fall of the Know-Nothing Party, which was a party that was extremely anti-immigrant due to the influx of new European immigrants, particularly into the North at the time. Nativism burst onto the political stage. Nativism was essentially the idea that the good jobs and, of course, political positions should be left strictly to natives of America. Not Native Americans, but native-born white Americans. As a result, they formed their own political party, the Know-Nothing Party, that want to reserve political offices for native-born Americans. And they combined anti-Catholic with anti-slavery sentiment. But again, much of that anti-slavery sentiment had more to do with the conflict between slave and free labor than it had to do with issues of race itself. And they also had an opposition to liquor as well, which tied them in a bit with the temperance movement as well. However, European immigrants in general benefited from being white, from white male suffrage laws, and the Western states' desperation for labor. So the Know-Nothing Party never really gained substantial political traction in the region at the time. Another new party was formed in 1854, this being the Republican Party, which was formed primarily by ex-Whigs and Free Soilers, and it's pretty much signaled the end of the Free Soil Party as most of them folded within the Republican Party. Now, this is the same Republican Party that still exists today, and the party was based primarily on free labor ideology. Republicans were able to convince most Northerners that the slave power threatened their liberties and aspirations, and they adhered to this idea of free labor. Not free labor as in labor that costs nothing, as in slave labor, which in itself is not free, as there is investment involved in slave labor as well, but rather free labor as in labor done by free people, particularly, of course, free white men. There was economic mobility to be had with this ideology. If slavery were to spread, that economic mobility would be stifled according to this free labor ideology. Therefore, slavery must be kept out of the new territories so that free labor could flourish. and they developed this idea called Freedom National, which did not mean abolition, but it meant ending the federal government's support of slavery itself. The year 1856 proved to be crucial for the rise in popularity of the Republican Party and the increase in tensions that would ultimately result in civil war just 5 years later. When Kansas held elections, pro-slavery Missourians from just across the border came into Kansas and cast fraudulent ballots, and as a result of this election fraud, a pro-slavery government was established in the Kansas Territory, which quickly wrote a constitution that enshrined slavery in that territory. To combat that, anti-slavery settlers in Kansas formed a rival government which also wrote a constitution that prohibited slavery in the territory. And for a brief while, two different territorial governments existed in Kansas, one pro and one anti-slavery. This resulted in what has become known as Bleeding Kansas, or this sporadic civil war that broke out between pro and anti-slavery settlers, which was extremely violent in places. And this violence between these pro and anti-slavery forces discredited the idea of popular sovereignty and proved that it would not be a viable policy or way to deal with the expansion of slavery, and would only promote greater tensions and greater violence. Speaking of tensions and violence, during this period as well, there was an episode on the floor of Congress itself when a Southern congressman from South Carolina, Preston Brooks, actually attacked a Northern Republican abolitionist congressman, Charles Sumner, on the floor of Congress itself and beat him almost to death with a cane over some comments that Sumner had made that were particularly disparaging of some of Preston Brooks' Southern relatives. And according to the Southern Code of Honor at the time, Preston Brooks took it upon himself to defend the honor of his family and show Charles Sumner exactly what was what, if you will. Of course, this made Sumner a martyr in the eyes of Northerners, particularly among the Republican Party, and it made Preston Brooks a hero amongst the pro-slavery elements in the South. In the election of 1856, Democrat James Buchanan won the presidency, and the election showed that the parties were largely based on sectional alliances, a development that would not bode well for the next election. As you can see from this map right here, the Republicans pretty much swept most of the North, particularly New England and those northern states a little bit west of that were primarily settled by New England settlers. There was still some Democratic or pro-slavery support in the southern part of the northern territories, particularly, of course, those areas that were directly connected and most tied in and most sympathetic to the Southern and Democratic cause. Alright gang, that concludes part 4 of our chapter 13 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.